Hi everybody, this is Professor John Gillespie, and this is my video presentation on Manifest Destiny, Expansion, and War. And we're going to be looking at how the increasing numbers of white Americans that are moving into the lands west of the Mississippi is going to put pressure on Washington to move into those lands and annex those lands. Advocates of what's called Manifest Destiny are going to start propagandizing on behalf of annexing these territories. And while the settlers themselves and some of their friends and their relatives and even business partners in the East are going to start lobbying for expansion, others are going to fear that expansion is going to cause sectional conflicts, that is, the conflict over slavery. These efforts are in vain. For in the 1840s, expansionists helped push the United States into a war that will forever become a triumph for the ideas of manifest destiny. Well, the United States emerged from the War of 1812 a beaten and bruised and battered nation, but nevertheless very confident. After all, the United States had survived a war with a major European power, namely England, and hey, we're still standing. A spirit of nationalism pervaded the air, and one newspaper editorial declared that the Republic, reposing on the laurels of a glorious war, gathers the rich harvest of an honorable peace. Everywhere the sound of the axe is heard, the opening of the forest to the sun, and claiming for agriculture the range of the buffalo. Our cities grow and towns rise up as if by magic. The Republic lives, and in honor. And so this period under investigation in this section of the video, 1815 to 1821, is known as the era of good feelings. So why is everybody feeling so good during this era of good feelings? Well, there was, as we said, this glorious war in which we had stood up to a major European power and survived. And there's just one political party. You'll recall that the Federalists died in 1815 thanks to the Hartford Convention, in which they're seen as traitorous. And so now everyone is a Republican. And this doesn't mean that everybody shares the same political, economic, or ideological beliefs. It simply means that everybody is masquerading, you might say, under a single party name, Republican. And in 1816, James Monroe, a Republican, obviously, is elected President of the United States. Monroe is the last of the so-called Virginia dynasty, which is a line of presidents that includes Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, all of which from Virginia. And so he symbolizes stability, continuity, and tradition. He is the last president of this revolutionary generation, the last president to wear a powdered wig. James Monroe says, "Our country may be likened to a new house. We may lack many things, but we possess the most precious of all, liberty." So the election of 1816, the presidential election, was a referendum on the War of 1812. And although the U.S. did not win the War of 1812, the peace was nevertheless acceptable to most. Also, the Federalist Party, as we had mentioned earlier, had shot itself in the foot for opposing the war, and then the 1815 Hartford Convention actually flirted with the idea of secession. And so 1816 is the last time that the Federalist Party is able to run a presidential candidate, a man called Rufus King of New York, and as you can see, they did not do very well, claiming just a few states in the far north. So a new line of heroes emerges from the War of 1812. You have the naval hero Stephen Decatur, who won several battles in the Great Lakes. You had Francis Scott Key, who penned what is going to become the national anthem. And of course you have Andrew Jackson, the hero of Horseshoe Bend and the Battle of New Orleans, which is the latter one, the Battle of New Orleans, kept the British from invading the United States from the south, and well, it was a major victory for the U.S. Of course, it was not a strategic victory because the peace treaty had already been signed, but nevertheless, this was a headline of the day. Still, even among all of the so-called good feelings, sectional tension, that is, tension between the North and the South, could be seen. Despite the one-party rule, the sense of unity two Americas developed along different lines. You had the industrializing, the tariff-loving, the free labor capitalist North, which was benefiting from the Erie Canal, from internal improvements, from the American system. And then you had the Cotton Kingdom in the South, which was not. And this is a system based on slave labor, and one might say feudalism. And so these two Americas have very different agendas for the future of the Republic. Are we going to be a capitalist nation that raises protective tariffs and advocates for free labor, or are we going to be an agricultural republic which is dependent on slave labor? What we're going to see is that every time the U.S. acquires new territory, whether it be Florida or Texas or half of Mexico, you're going to see the North and the South have a bitter war of words that's eventually going to turn into an actual war over who is going to control that territory. In 1819, North America was divided among several European powers. It was not entirely the domain of the United States. This is the United States right here. The U.S. controls the eastern seaboard, some of the southeast, excluding Florida, and, of course, the Louisiana Territory, which was acquired by Thomas Jefferson in 1803. Great Britain to the west still controls Canada and what is called the Oregon Territory, although the United States and Great Britain share the Oregon Territory, or jointly occupy, one should say. Spain still retains Southwest and Florida. The U.S., however, has a problem. Enslaved black people from the American South have been escaping into Florida, and there they have been living with the Seminole Indians, or setting up their own marooned colonies, or freed African American or African communities. The Spanish government, which is in control of Florida, is turning a blind eye and allowing these escaped slaves to live there and not doing a thing about it. So President Monroe must deal with this problem in a way that is acceptable to both the North and the South and to Spain. As you're about to find out, it's going to be a quite formidable problem. The South Carolinian, John C. Calhoun, and Monroe's Secretary of State, offers a solution. He says, let's do this. Let's send the war hero Andrew Jackson into Florida to retrieve the so-called U.S. property, namely the escaped enslaved people. Jackson is under strict orders from Washington. 1, you are to pursue the enslaved people or the Indians only with Spanish knowledge and cooperation. You are not to attack Spanish forts or settlement, and there are also British in the area. You are not to involve the British, harass them, molest them in any way. Well, Jackson disagrees with how his mission is to be carried out. So he invades Spanish Florida with 3,000 men. He attacks and burns 2 Spanish forts, and he hangs 2 British subjects who complained about the presence of Americans in Spanish Florida. And then he raises the flag over Florida and declares the entire peninsula to be under U.S. protection. Monroe and Calhoun now have a diplomatic crisis on their hands dealing with Jackson, Spain, and England. Calhoun calls for Jackson to be court-martialed, which could lead to his hanging. And once again, sectional differences weigh into this decision. What are we to do with Jackson, who is wildly popular in the first place? The North does not want to see Florida added to the Union because that means that Florida could turn into a state, and the state would be populated by people, and those people would likely be cotton growers and slaveholders. And that means that slave interests or slaveholding interests would dominate the national legislature. Now, the South wants exactly the opposite. They do want to see Florida added because that would weigh and give greater power to the southern states in the national legislature. So we see a sectional crisis beginning to develop. The Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, has an idea. Spain is geopolitically weak. Why don't we make a deal in order to save face? And we can also help ease sectional tensions at home, that is, make the proposal both acceptable to North and South. And so he calls up the Spanish Foreign Secretary Luis de Onís y González Farah. And together they work out what's called the Adams-Onís Treaty of 1819. The first part of the Adams-Onís Treaty is that Spain is going to cede Florida, that is, give Florida to the USA. And this is going to make the American South happy because they are going to acquire new territory that may one day be a state. Part 2 is Spain is going to permit the U.S. to build a transcontinental railroad through the Southwest. And this is going to have a terminus somewhere in, let's say, Illinois or so one of these areas that participates in the commerce of the Erie Canal. And this is going to make the North happy. And Part 3, which makes Spain and the North happy, is that the U.S. denounces all future claims to Texas, which is a territory of northern Spain. And this, of course, makes Spain and the North happy. Well, in the early 19th century, the Spanish Empire was not very powerful. In fact, it's in its death throes. Colony after colony is going to declare independence from the old Spanish Empire and establish independent republics. You have Colombia in 1810, Mexico, 1810, Chile, 1810, Argentina, 1819, Venezuela, 1811, El Salvador, 1812, and Guatemala, 1821. So the United States formally declared neutrality in these wars between Spain and its former colonies, but nevertheless, they sold supplies and sent things to the rebels. President Monroe established diplomatic relations with Argentina, Chile, Peru, Mexico, and Colombia, and the U.S. looked to their neighbors at the South as baby republics, burgeoning democratic states that needed nurture and protection. And then England steps in with this bold proposal. England says to the United States, we really do have a common interest here for once. I know we've had some trouble in the past. You used to be our former colonies, and then we had to go to war with you in 1812. But let's see past all that and see if we can work out an agreement that's beneficial to us both. You see, both of us want to keep Spain from reclaiming its former colonies. We both want to keep Spain weak. And we also have an interest in seeing other European nations from making claims in North America. Doesn't that sound like a good idea, President Monroe? So the British Foreign Minister said, look here, why don't we do this? Let's form the Anglo-American Joint Declaration. In fact, we'll call it the Anglo-American Joint Declaration of 1822, in which we'll say together in one voice, neither the U.S. or Britain will make any claims to former Spanish territory or allow others to do so. Monroe says, yeah, that's a good idea, and he wanted to sign it. But once again, his very shrewd and forward-looking Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, had a problem. He says, if we sign this joint Anglo-American declaration, this means that not only is Great Britain and the other European countries prohibited from expanding into the West, but that includes us too. The U.S. would also be formally hemmed in and prohibited from expansion. We don't like that at all. So John Quincy Adams makes his own move. He says, look, let's reject Britain's proposal and let's make our own. We'll call it the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. It really should be called the John Quincy Adams Doctrine. He was the one who came up with it, but he handed it to Monroe, said, hey, read this. Monroe says, yeah. Essentially, it says this: the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Notice, European, not American. We're free to colonize and expand anywhere we want. We're just telling European nations not to do it. So with Americans moving westward, a lot of new stars, new states are being added to the Union. You have Ohio, 1803. You have Louisiana, 1812, Indiana, 1816, Mississippi, 1817, Illinois, 1818, and Alabama, 1819. Now, I want you to notice not only that these are being added chronologically as I've presented them, but notice the north-south balance. We add a northern state, and then we add a southern state, and then we add a northern state, and we add a southern state. This is by design because we want to keep power in the legislature balanced between the northern states, the tariff-loving, industrializing, canal-building northern states, and the southern states, which are increasingly dependent on a single crop, cotton, and agriculture and slave labor. And then Missouri applies for statehood in 1819. And Missouri is very centrally located, and so the question that everybody wants to know is, how are they going to go? They apply as a slave state. And now the Senate in 1819 is at 11 free states and 11 slave states. And so the addition of Missouri as a slave state would offset that balance and give the South greater power in the Senate. And so what's at stake? As we know, tariffs are at stake, internal improvements are at stake, the bank could be at stake, and slavery could also be at stake. You are seeing voices begin to grow louder in the North that are critical of slavery. Abolitionists, yes, but most of the people growing critical of slavery are critical of the fact that free white labor has to compete with slave labor, thereby lowering wages and, so they believe, limiting their chances for prosperity. Well, the New York Congressman James Talmadge offers what he thinks is going to be a fair solution, and we'll call that the Talmadge Amendment. He says, look, admit Missouri as a slave state, as they are asking, and go ahead and provide for gradual emancipation of slaves at age 25, meaning that sooner or later they will all be free. And then block further introduction of slavery after 1820. And so the idea is that, yes, we're going to admit them as a slave state, but slowly slave power will be drained away from the state and it will become a free state. Well, Congress is going to vote on this, and the House, which is populated mostly by Northerners, says, yes, we will accept the Talmadge Amendment. But the Senate, in which you stand 11 free and 11 slave, votes no. And so the Talmadge Amendment fails, and we are still brewing this Missouri crisis. Well, lucky for us, Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky, former Speaker of the House, has a solution, which we'll call the Missouri Compromise. He says what we'll do is let's draw a line at the 3630 line of parallel, which is Missouri's southern border. And north of that border, we're going to say we're not going to have slavery because it's not going to take root there anyway. It would be difficult to grow cotton, and so no slavery above the 3630 line of parallel. Now, below the 3630 line of parallel, we're going to say slavery is okay. Now, I want you to pay attention to the line and pay attention to the territory that the U.S. has. This, of course, only refers to the territory that the U.S. has acquired, namely the Louisiana Territory. Any new states that are going to enter into the Louisiana Territory, this Missouri Compromise will apply. Now, we are going to add Missouri, and Missouri is coming in as a slave state. So what are we going to do about the balance? Well, we'll do this. We'll make a new state, and we'll call it Maine, and we'll carve it out of some of the relatively unsettled territory of Massachusetts. And so we'll have a brand new state, and so the Senate will now be at 12 free and 12 slave. And everybody will be happy about this. And if you've ever looked at a Maine license plate, their state motto is the Free State. And this is why. So again, the House, the legislature has to vote. The House votes yes, and the Senate votes yes. And we've put a band-aid on this sectional crisis, and whoopee, we get to avoid a civil war, at least for now. In the wake of the Missouri crisis, two prominent Americans weighed in on the issue. One of them was Thomas Jefferson, who said, the Missouri question is the most portentous one which ever yet threatened our Union. In the gloomiest moment of the Revolutionary War, I never had any apprehensions equal to what I feel from this source. The question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. We have a wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Now, John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, said, I take it for granted that the present question is a mere preamble, a title page, to a great, tragic volume. How right they were. Well, the U.S. once claimed Texas as part of the Louisiana Purchase, but because of the Adams-Onis Treaty, the U.S. renounced that claim in 1819. Since then, the U.S. had twice tried to purchase Texas from Mexico, and twice Mexico has refused. In 1820, then, the Mexican government launched an ill-advised experiment. Why don't we invite American settlers into the northern territory of Tejas? And the hope is to assert sovereignty over the area and to boost the economy. The Anglo impresarios, as they were called, are going to be granted a 4-year exemption from taxes, and they have 3 conditions if they're going to take up a settlement in northern Mexico. They, 1, have to become a Mexican citizen. 2, they have to learn Spanish, and they have to abide by all Mexican laws. And 3, they have got to convert to Roman Catholicism, which is the national religion of Mexico. Well, by 1830, there are 7,000 Anglos living in Texas, more than twice the number of Tejanos. And Tejanos is our word for Mexican-born Texans, or Mexicans who are residents of that northern state called Texas, or Tejas. Now, many of these Anglos are bringing their slaves, their enslaved black people, into Mexico. And what they're doing is they're hoping to participate in the growing cotton kingdom of the U.S. We'll come down here, we'll claim some cheap land, we'll grow cotton, we'll send it back to the United States where it will be sold on the open market, and we'll make some money. Now, the most successful of these impresarios was Stephen F. Austin. Stephen F. Austin was, let's say, cautiously critical of slavery, but nevertheless was willing to accept its existence in Texas because this is what so many of the settlers wanted to do. Well, anyway, Stephen F. Austin was the first legal Anglo settlement. He brought his folks down there in 1822. Now, Austin was a settler. He was not a speculator. He settled a land grant between the Brazos and the Nueces River, and he really did hope to live peacefully. And he did follow the rules. He learned Spanish. He obeyed the laws. He became a Roman Catholic. And he was actually one of the last holdouts that wanted to remain loyal to Mexico before independence in 1836. Well, one of the more troublesome impresarios was a guy named Hayden Edwards. Edwards was also given a land grant, just like Stephen F. Austin. He was given it in 1825, which allowed him to bring 800 families to Texas. That was just north of Austin's colony near Nacogdoches. All impresarios were required to respect existing land grants that were held by both Anglos and Tejanos. But Hayden took it upon himself to demand that everyone provide written documentation of the title to their land, or else he would personally evict them. Now, this is not going to work because the older and almost invariably Tejano or Mexican residents had been there for sometimes hundreds of years, and no documentation was available, especially given the fact that some of them had settled in this area before Mexico had declared its independence from Spain. Well, Edwards doesn't much care for this, and so he says, get out. No documentation, no land. And his plan all along was to evict the older and largely Tejano residents, claim their land, and then resell it to American settlers from the north. So the evicted Tejanos appeal to Mexico City for help, and Mexico City, I think, rightly comes down on their side, and they revoke Edwards' land grant, and they just really tell him to get lost. Edwards and his brother don't like this one bit, and so they declare independence from Mexico in 1826, and they call their land grant, the area on which they're sitting, the Republic of Fredonia, or it was supposed to be named, kind of after freedom, and that's the flag, the Freedom and Justice flag, highly underscored and underlined. And if you look at the Texas flag today, you'll see that Texas has incorporated the flag of Fredonia into the Lone Star flag. Well, anyway, he looks to Stephen F. Austin and says, hey, do you want to join? I've declared independence from Mexico. And Stephen F. Austin says, no thanks. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and stay faithful to Mexico and loyal to Mexico, and no. So the Mexican government sends troops northward to put down Hayden's rebellion in 1827. Stephen F. Austin actually sends troops from his colony to help the Mexican government out. And so together, the Fredonian rebellion ends quickly and decisively with both Mexican and American, if you will, from Stephen F. Austin colonies help. But Edwards' rebellion has raised some suspicions in the government in Mexico City. They look northward and they wonder just what the hell's going on up there. Are there Anglos up there that are plotting rebellion? Are they going to remain loyal? How many future Fredonias are we going to have to put down? So in 1828, Mexico dispatches an investigator, Manuel Mier y Terran, to Texas. And they say, go look around, take a look, and report back to us on what you see. The Mier y Terran report sounds alarms in Mexico City because he says things like, as one covers the distance from Bejar, that's around San Antonio, to this town, he will note that Mexican influence is proportionately diminished. Until on arriving in this place, he will see that it is almost nothing. And indeed, whence could such influence come? Hardly from superior numbers in population, since the ratio of Mexicans to foreigners is 1 to 10. Certainly not from the superior character of the Mexican population, for exactly the opposite is true. The Mexicans of this town comprising what in all countries is called the lowest class, the very poor and the very ignorant. Well, in response to the report, the Mexican government decides to crack down, and they issue what is called the Law of April 6th, 1830. That's what it's called, the Law of April 6th, 1830. It bans all future or further Anglo immigration from Mexico into Mexico. No new Anglo settlement into Mexico. And it also halts, of course, any new impresario contracts. Furthermore, it erects a series of forts and presidios to stop potential migrants from the U.S. In other words, they built a wall in order to prevent illegal immigration from the United States. And they prohibited enslaved people from being brought into Mexico. You see, Mexico had officially banned slavery in 1829, but the Mexican government had turned a blind eye in order to sort of keep its northern occupants, its impresario population, happy. Then they start placing tariffs on goods entering Mexico from the United States, which is going to place a financial burden on people hoping to participate in the Cotton Kingdom. So how many Anglos did live in Tejas in the 1830s? It is actually kind of hard to say because a lot of the immigration into Mexico was illegal. Nevertheless, here's a modest estimate. In 1821, you have about 2,000 Tejanos, 300 Anglos. Right there, that's the original colony that came in under Austin. In 1830, you've got 3,000 Tejanos and 20,000 Anglos. So those numbers are more than reversed and multiplied. In 1833, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is elected president of Mexico. Now, he is a capable and skilled military general, is also known as the Napoleon of the West. And he makes it a priority to look north and say, I am going to crack down on those rebellious Texans. I'm going to bring order to my northern territories. And so in order to do that, he makes a number of provocative, even controversial moves. One, he moves the Texan capital from Saltillo to Monclova, and that move is to take the center of government away from where most of the Anglos are living. And then he revokes the Constitution of 1824, and this is a move that is perhaps the most controversial because the Constitution of 1824 was essentially a Confederate Constitution. It allowed for expansive states' rights, and it allowed for self-government in the various states of Mexico. And he replaces it with a federal constitution, or a stronger centralized government. And this is troublesome to the empresarios because when they had agreed to come to Mexico, they had agreed to abide by the laws of the Constitution of 1824. And so what happens if the Constitution of 1824 is revoked? Are we still bound to follow the new Constitution? Are we still bound to pledge support to Santa Anna? Or, shall we continue in the old ways? One Texan says Santa Anna intends to free our slaves and make slaves of us.
And so, by 1836, it was clear that the Anglo-Texans and also a fair number of Tejanos were through with Mexican rule. They declared themselves free of, quote, despotism of the sword and the priesthood, and declared independence. The Texas Declaration of Independence reads, when a government has ceased to protect the lives, liberty, and property of the people, from whom its legitimate powers are derived, and for the advancement of whose happiness it was instituted, and so far from being a guarantee for their inestimable and inalienable rights, becomes an instrument in the hands of evil rulers for their oppression, then we have the right and the responsibility to overthrow it. And so I want you to notice that it was modeled on the American Declaration of Independence, and John Locke, the great Enlightenment thinker who so influenced the American Declaration, is infused into this. His ideas of government, natural rights, and freedom are clearly echoed. His fingerprints are all over the Texas Declaration of Independence. And in February 1836, Santa Anna decided he was going to put a stop to this, and he ordered the Mexican army north to confront a group of rebels who had taken shelter inside of the Alamo, which is an old Spanish fort near the town of San Antonio. The Alamo housed 187 rebels, including the famous William B. Travis, Davy Crockett from Tennessee, Jim Bowie from Louisiana, and of course, several Tejanos who were also opposed to Santa Anna's rule. Now, they were confronted with 2,000 well-armed Mexican soldiers, and let's just say they really didn't stand a chance. It was a bloodbath. All 187 Texan rebels were killed and gave rise to the war cry, "Remember the Alamo." By April 1836, General Sam Houston managed to surprise and crush Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna was personally captured, taken prisoner at what was called the Yorktown of Texas. The peace treaty that followed was called the Treaty of Velasco. It granted Texas independence, and this is the interesting part, granted Texas the territory up to the Rio Grande. The Mexican troops will evacuate the territory of Texas, passing to the other side of the Rio Grande del Norte. Now, that's the Rio Grande to us. And what this means is that Texas is actually claiming more land than the original state of Tejas ever encompassed. Santa Anna signed it, but while he was under duress, that is, he was a prisoner when he signed the Treaty of Velasco, thereby casting a lot of suspicion on the legitimacy of this treaty. So here's the problem. The borders of Tejas extended roughly to the Nueces River. The rebels now are claiming the territory up to the Rio Grande, where Texas impresarios had very little claim. And so Santa Anna is released, and the Mexican government immediately rejects the Treaty of Velasco, saying he signed it while a gun was to his head. This cannot be a legitimate treaty. So now what? Where are we? Is Texas independent? Where are its borders? And how is the United States going to respond to this dispute between the now Republic of Texas, or the Lone Star Republic, and the United States? Well, the Lone Star Republic immediately applied for statehood within the United States. But the Texas Constitution added a very troublesome feature. It read, all persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude. And also, emancipation is illegal in Texas, and free blacks are prohibited from residing in Texas. So Texas has made a very clear call. We are going to be a slave state. Free blacks are illegal here. And furthermore, no emancipation will ever take place in Texas. And this is really going to muddy the waters, so to speak, for people who want to see Texas added to the United States, because there is going to be no compromise on the issue of slavery. And because of this problem, the slavery problem, Congress votes not to annex Texas as a state. One Texas emissary said in 1838, many of our friends, as well as enemies in Congress, dread the coming of the question at this time, on account of the desperate death struggle which they foresee, which will inevitably ensue between the North and South, a struggle involving the probability of a dissolution of this union. But Texas continues to grow. Its population begins to expand. 40,000 whites inhabited Texas in 1840 and 5,000 enslaved people. That grows to 150,000 whites in 1845 and 20,000 enslaved people. And cotton also grows, competing with the cotton kingdom of the American South and threatening to divide the profits that the American cotton growers of places like Louisiana, South Carolina, and Alabama are trying to claim for themselves. And so, the Republic of Texas begins to open up negotiations with Britain and France. Britain thinking that perhaps she might be able to add Texas to her empire. And France, of course, thinking that we could divide the cotton profits of the American South and negotiate for ourselves a better price. Well, between 1836 and 1845, Texas annexation was the issue of the day. And of course, the other issue surrounding Texas annexation was the big issue of slavery. Southerners hoped for another slave state, and of course, Northerners did not. Texas was also beginning to flex its economic muscle by entering into competition with the American cotton farmers. And as we said in the last section, England even suggested adding Texas to its empire, and they opened up a Texas emissary in London, which is still standing today, and you can go visit it. John Tyler became the President of the United States in 1841 after the death of William Henry Harrison. He was William Henry Harrison's vice president, and so he was known as an accidental president. Now, he was a Whig and party affiliation, but all of his opinions, including that on the bank and the tariff, and especially on expansionism, of which he was a really big fan, all favored the Democrats. And so, because Tyler was clearly a Democrat in disguise, he was expelled from the Whig Party, leaving him without a political home for the remainder of his presidency. By the time we get to the election of 1844, it is all about Texas. The Whigs decide they're going to have absolutely nothing to do with that Democrat in disguise, John Tyler, and they nominate the old party favorite, Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Henry Clay takes a, compromising position on Texas. He said he's okay with it as long as it doesn't incite war, and then he goes on record and says, annexation and war with Mexico are identical. So where we stand on this, we're okay with it so long as it doesn't cause war, but annexation and war with Mexico, they're the same thing. So where does he stand? The Democrats choose the Tennessean James K. Polk, who gives us a much clearer position on Texas. He says, the Republic of Texas has made known her desire to come into our union, to form part of our confederacy, and enjoy with us the blessings of liberty secured and guaranteed by our Constitution. So, Texas, hell yeah, we're going to take them in. So the war over Texas is on. So this is the campaign flag that James K. Polk and his running mate put together. And you see that little star off to the side there? That extra star at the top of his campaign flag symbolizes Polk's support for Texas annexation. Polk triumphed in 1844, both an electoral and a popular vote win. It was also, of course, a major triumph for the South. One Southern voter says, "We have triumphed. Polk is nearer to us than any public man who is named. He is a large slaveholder and he plants cotton." So Polk's program is pretty ambitious. He wants to secure Texas. That is, he wants to secure the Texas border at the Rio Grande. He also wants to obtain California and add that to the Union. He also wants to obtain the Oregon Territory and add that to the Union. Because he's a good Democrat, he wants to reduce the tariff, and he also wants to establish an independent treasury to replace the bank that Andrew Jackson had killed. Well, he doesn't actually get to move on Texas on his own because the lame duck, John Tyler, actually managed to push a Texas annexation bill through Congress in February of 1845. This was his last official act in office before he stepped out of the White House, and he secured it through a joint resolution of Congress. Texas became the 28th state and also the 15th and largest slave state in the Union. So how much of Texas did the U.S. claim? Well, all of it. Everything claimed by the Treaty of Velasco. And this is going to be problematic because the United States has now officially annexed land that another country formally claims. Mexico protests, the U.S. says nothing, and Mexico cuts off diplomatic relationship with the United States. And westward expansionism is absolutely the topic of the times. The Democratic journalist John O'Sullivan expressed the spirit of the day in an editorial in the Democratic Review in 1845. He says, "And that claim is by the right our manifest destiny, that is our obvious destiny, to overspread and possess the whole continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us." This reflects the popular belief that God had bestowed on white Americans the mandate to spread their ideas, their government, their culture, their religion across the continent. And they saw this as a blessing to others. And at his inauguration, James K. Polk expressed a very similar belief as that of John O'Sullivan in Manifest Destiny. He says, "This heaven-favored land enjoys the most admirable and wisest system of well-regulated self-government ever devised by human minds. Who shall assign limits to the achievements of free minds and free hands under the protection of this glorious union?" And so with Florida being annexed in 1819 and Texas formally annexed by Tyler in 1845, Polk firmly believed that the U.S. had a right and a duty to keep on expanding westward. One of Polk's campaign promises was to deliver the Oregon Territory into U.S. hands. Now, Oregon was jointly shared by the United States and England. Both of them had fishing rights there, and both of them enjoyed the sharing of that territory. Polk's campaign cry was 5440 or a fight, meaning that the U.S. should acquire all of Oregon right up to Alaska. You can see the 5440 line all the way up there. Polk even suggested that he was going to go to war with England for the territory. Now, this is probably a bluff. He really didn't want to go to war with England. Last time we went to war with England, it didn't turn out so well for us, but Polk is flexing his muscles. He's rattling his saber. He's trying to get England to perhaps end up in some kind of negotiation. And the bluff pays off. It wins. Britain decides that they are going to sign a treaty that splits the territory at 49th parallel. Of course, Great Britain is going to take the territory to the north, and the United States is going to take the territory to the south, and that puts us right up against the Mexican border at the 42nd parallel. Well, since independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico had not really prospered. 2 decades of political instability resulted in a stagnant economy and only very modest tax revenues. The northern provinces of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah were very sparsely settled. In 1840, there were just 75,000 people, many of whom were harassed by Native Americans who didn't much care for the Mexican presence in what they considered to be their territory. The inability to maintain Texas and the Texas Rebellion in 1836 caused the expansionists in the United States to literally, well, smell blood in the water and decide to descend upon what they thought would be defenseless Mexico. So in 1845, Polk dispatches a guy named John C. Fremont, who's also known as the Great Pathfinder, to California on an exploring party. Now, of course, John C. Fremont is trespassing. This is Mexican territory and really has no legal right to be there. He reaches the Sacramento River Valley by December of 1845, and there he's going to remain. Polk then sends the Louisiana Congressman John Slidell down to Mexico City, and he's got a job to do. He says, what I want you to do is offer to buy California, New Mexico, and secure the Texas border at the Rio Grande, all for the price of $30 million. Mexico is so insulted by what they see as an insult to their sovereignty that the Mexican officials refuse to meet with Slidell. And what this does is just gives President Polk, his mind anyway, license to proceed to Plan B, which is to take military action to try to get Mexico to cede some of its territory. He orders the American general Zachary Taylor and 2,000 U.S. soldiers into the Texas territory that is disputed by Mexico and the U.S. That is, he walks into that disputed territory with 2,000 soldiers. This is a clear provocation. Young Ulysses S. Grant, who you may know, is going to end up being a very influential general in the American Civil War, recalls, "We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it." Well, as to be expected, when the U.S. marches into what is considered to be Mexican territory, Mexico attacks the U.S. Army in May 1846 in defense of its own territory, or this is the way they see it, of course. President Polk delivered a war message to Congress that he had actually prepared weeks before he sent Zachary Taylor into the disputed territory. He said, "Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are now at war." Now, of course, this is all a matter of perspective. From the Mexican perspective, Americans have invaded Mexican territory and Mexico has defended herself. But Polk doesn't want to see it that way. He sees this as clearly American. We've annexed it legally, according to him, in 1845, and we have every right to send our troops into that. Well, what are we going to do? One Whig congressman from Illinois, you may know him as Abraham Lincoln, stood up and demanded to know, where exactly is that spot in? Abraham Lincoln's sentiments were shared by many for various reasons. The essayist and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "The United States will conquer Mexico, but Mexico will poison us." He's speaking to the slavery controversy that he knows is going to arrive from the acquisition of new territory. His protege, Henry David Thoreau, actually spent a night in jail because he wouldn't pay his taxes, knowing that his taxes would go to support the war, and that the war, according to him, was fought only to enlarge slave territory. So he says, "I'm going to spend a night in jail." He actually got bailed out by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he wasn't happy about it. Now, John C. Calhoun, the South Carolinian, he opposed annexing Mexican territory for different reasons. He didn't want to annex the Mexicans. He said, "Ours is a government for the white man. It should never welcome any but the Caucasian race. And also, the political parties were polarized on this issue as well. The Whigs splintered into a new group called the Conscience Whigs, and they formed in opposition to the spread of slavery. The Democrats likewise split. The Northern Party members opposed the war to some extent, and Southern members of the Democrats, of course, were in support of it. The most divisive piece of legislation, however, was introduced by the Pennsylvania Democrat David Wilmot. And I really want to take a look at this because this is what's known as the Wilmot Proviso. He says, as an express and fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico by the United States, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the said territory. I make no war upon the South, nor upon slavery in the South. I have no squeamish sensitiveness upon the subject of slavery, nor morbid sympathy for the slave. I plead the cause of the rights of the white freeman. I would preserve for free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance, where the sons of toil, of my own race and color, can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. I stand for the inviolability of free territory. It shall remain free, so far as my voice or my vote can aid in the preservation of its character. And so there's some things I want you to notice about this document. David Wilmot is saying, whatever we get from Mexico, I don't want any slavery to be in there. But he's not an abolitionist, is he? He's also saying, look, I don't want any black people out there either. You see, David Wilmot is not motivated by, as he would say, morbid sympathy for the slave. He is motivated by what's going to come to be known as free labor ideology, also known as free soil ideology. In other words, I want the West, so he says, to be free of slavery because free white men do not want to go out there and compete with slave labor. So he's anti-slavery, but he does not have a whole lot of sympathy for the slaves. He doesn't care a whole lot about the plight of black people. And I also want to point out, this is the shape, this is the form, this is the type of anti-slavery sentiment that is going to drive us toward the Civil War. Yes, we have abolitionists who do believe that slavery is wrong, rightfully so, on moral grounds. But they tend to be more isolated, and they tend not to be mainstream anti-slavery sentiment. Well, during this Mexican-American War of 1846, the U.S. performed surprisingly well. General Kearny made a long march from Missouri to Santa Fe, and he captured that town with ease, and then marched on to California to meet with John C. Fremont. John C. Fremont, you recall, when he heard that the war had broken out, led what was called the Bear Flag Revolt up near San Francisco and declared California free from Mexican rule. So Fremont and Kearny then completed the conquest of California by 1846. But Mexico did not cede territory or acknowledge defeat. So the war continues to expand. Polk then dispatches General Winfield Scott to Tampico, where he took control of the port city and then marched south sailed south to Veracruz, and from there launched an assault on Mexico City, which is the capital. He won every battle, despite the fierce Mexican and brave opposition to the American invaders. In September 1847, Scott marched triumphantly into Mexico City and forced the Mexican government to begin to talk, signal its willingness to discuss a peace, which will be very much dictated on American terms. So here we have the Americans entering Mexico City in 1847. One American staff officer recalled, "Our march into the city was extremely warlike, with drawn sabers and daggers in every look. From around corners, men with surly countenances and downcast looks regarded us with watchfulness. If not terror, and black eyes looked through the latticed windows at the column of cavaliers, some gleaming with pleasure and others filled with tears. As the American flag was raised and the cannon boomed its glorious national salute from the hill, the pent-up emotions of many of the women could be suppressed no longer. As the wail of grief arose from the din of our horses' tread and reached our ears from the depth of the gloomy-looking buildings on every hand. A Mexican observer, actually the president of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz, remarked, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." The treaty which ended the Mexican-American War in 1848 was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It confirmed the Rio Grande as the border of Texas. It also demanded that Mexicans cede California, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado to the United States. This is the so-called Mexican Cession of 1848. The U.S., in turn, will pay $15 million in indemnities. And I want you to recall the original offer for California and parts of the border was $30 million. The 75,000 Mexicans in the area will have 2 years to become U.S. citizens or repatriate to Mexico and leave, go south to the border. The U.S. now has a lot of new land, but the so-called Mexican Cession has intensified a divisive issue, that of slavery.